We'll start right at 7. Okay, be good. Okay. Good evening. I'm John Wensky, Vice Chair of the Shrewsbury School Committee, and welcome to our meeting for Wednesday, July 15th, 2020. Chairperson Sandra Fritz is on a well-deserved vacation. Tonight's virtual meeting is being broadcast live on Selco's channels 29 and 329 and streamed live on Shrewsbury Media Connections website. Thank you to SMC Executive Director Mark Serra and SPS IT Specialist Chris Hardy for supporting this meeting. Tonight's meeting will be rebroadcast between now and our next scheduled meeting for Wednesday, July 22nd. We do offer public participation during our virtual meetings, although no one is scheduled to present tonight. I do encourage the public to contact the school committee if you have anything to speak about that's specific to school-related topics. Please email us in advance of our next meeting on July 22nd, and our email address is schoolcommittee@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. Our first order of business is chairperson and members' reports. Colleagues, anything to report? And I'm just looking at the various boxes. No, we're good. All right. The next item on our agenda is superintendent's report. Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Wensky. I wanted to mention a couple of my leadership colleagues from here in the town of Shrewsbury who have recently retired or will be retiring. I'd like to start by mentioning Chief James Hester of the Shrewsbury Police Department, who recently retired after serving, I believe, for about 12 years as the Chief of Police here in Shrewsbury, which is quite a long tenure for that role. He's been the Chief of Police all the years that I've been superintendent of schools, and I've enjoyed working with him a great deal. He was always extremely supportive of our schools. One of the first orders of business when he became chief was to institute the school resource officer positions at the high school, and then also one located at Oak Middle School that serves our grades up through before high school. And those positions have been extremely helpful over the years in a variety of ways relative to school safety and building sort of community policing within our schools. Anytime we had any sort of issue that we needed to engage with the police, Chief Hester was always, again, very collaborative and extremely supportive. And on behalf of everyone in the Shrewsbury Public Schools, I wanted to wish Chief Hester a well-deserved, happy and healthy retirement from his service to the town of Shrewsbury and the police department. Also, at the end of this week, Michael Hale, who is the executive director of Selco, previous to that, for many years, he was the assistant town manager, will be retiring. Mr. Hale also has been a tremendous supporter of our schools. Certainly, Selco, we would not be able to have the kind of educational technology program that we have without the infrastructure that Selco supplies to us, especially in terms of extremely reliable internet service that is very high speed, and it's been a good match, because as Selco continued to ramp up its capacity around internet to match streaming, and which is their greatest capacity is at night, they were able to match that for the capacity we needed during the school day. And of course, with the remote learning that we had to do over the course of the school closure, that internet connectivity was more important than ever. I always found Mr. Hale to be a very pragmatic, thoughtful leader. I really enjoyed working with him in various town department head meetings, and anytime we had to interact about anything connected to Selco in the schools. And he also not only was a very public supporter of our schools, he also did a tremendous amount behind the scenes to support public education in Shrewsbury. And so I want to take this opportunity to wish Michael well in his retirement, and thank him also for his service over the many years to the town of Shrewsbury. And that is, one more issue before I complete the superintendent's report. I also wanted to mention that we did receive a letter from the 4 leaders from the class of 2019 relative to the issue of equity and anti-racism. This letter was signed in support by, I believe, well over 700 other alumni and current students and parents. That letter was provided to myself, the school committee, and all of the school principals here in the school district. And we are looking to, we're happy to receive that letter. And we're looking to meet with the authors of the letter in the very near future to get clarity and discuss that information. And I will ask that that letter be put into the record with the materials for tonight's meeting as well, so that the public can access that letter on our website when those materials are added tomorrow. So again, I'm very pleased with the energy and the engagement that so many people have around this really critically important issue, and we'll be reporting in subsequent meetings on work that we are doing relative to this topic. And that is Superintendent's report this evening.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Our next order of business is a time-scheduled appointment with regards to resolution on state funding for COVID-19 expenses.
Mr. Wensky, Dr. McGee has his hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. Dr.
I
McGee.
just want to draw your attention. Ms. Heffernan. Oh, there it is. Ms. Heffernan just popped in. She had not been in.
Yeah.
She was in as an attendee. Now she's in as John Wensky.
Got it. No worries.
I am now John Wensky. Apologies to everybody for my.
There are two of us. I think you can distinguish between the two. Little technical difficulties here. Okay, so moving on to the next time schedule appointment, which is regarding resolution on state funding for COVID-19 expenses. Just background on this, the meeting on July 8th, Mr. Palage had advised that he'd be bringing a resolution requesting that the state guarantee every school district full reimbursement for whatever COVID-19 expenses are required to follow state mandates to the committee for review at our next meeting. This draft resolution has been enclosed in the book, and we're going to discuss and potentially vote on it. So with that, Mr. Palage, would you like to walk us through?
Thank you, Mr. Wensky. And colleagues, this resolution that I brought before you this evening is relatively straightforward. It is part of a statewide effort. This resolution has been adopted thus far, as of yesterday, by over 150 school committees across the Commonwealth. The gist of the resolution, which I'll read in full for the benefit of members and for those watching in the community, has to do with seeking state reimbursement for COVID-19 related expenses. As members of this committee know well, our school district is going to incur many costs related to COVID-19 and likely even more depending on how reopening unfurls in a logistical sense, as I know we're going to hear more about later this evening and in the coming weeks and months as many of those decisions are made. And of course, this compounds an existing issue we had in Shrewsbury where our financial situation was quite severe, even pre-COVID, looking ahead to our fiscal 21 budget. We were already in a position where the costs necessary to maintain the educational program that the community had come to expect was under threat. And we're now in a position where we are addressing some very important, very critical topics that we are in a position where not only might we not have necessary additional resources to devote to those topics, but we may be losing resources through need to address COVID-19. So I feel strongly that I do think that the committee should adopt this resolution. Again, I'll read it in full just a moment. I do recognize that, of course, the Commonwealth, just like the town of Shrewsbury, is in a significant financial bind. The Commonwealth cannot deficit spend like the federal government can. Having said that, the Commonwealth has more decisions that it can make than we do, and the Commonwealth has more tools in its tool chest for raising revenues that are available to municipal government and to the government here in the town of Shrewsbury. So the resolution that is before you this evening reads, whereas if schools are to reopen this fall in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is the responsibility of each school district to do so safely and responsibly. And whereas it is the responsibility of the state to ensure that each school district is able to pay for the enormous additional staffing, transportation, and material expenses required to do this. And whereas the state cannot expect mandatory COVID-19 safety guidelines to be followed without also ensuring that each school district has the funds required to implement these guidelines, therefore, let it be resolved that the state must guarantee every school district full reimbursement for whatever COVID-19 expenses are required to follow state mandates. We must ensure a statewide school reopening that is safe, responsible, and equitable. I would move that we adopt this resolution this evening and that further we send a copy thereof to members of our state's legislative delegation. It looks like Dr. McGee is speaking but muted.
I'll second it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any colleagues, any questions or comments? There being
I think
none.
it's well phrased, it's concise, it's important. Completely support it.
In agreement as well.
Yep, same here. Jason, thank you so much for drafting this very important resolution.
And just in fairness, the resolution was drafted by a school committee member from a regional school committee, I believe in Newbury. It's being adopted by school committees all across the Commonwealth. So I certainly don't want to take credit for authoring the language. This is us participating in a statewide effort.
Got it. Thank you, Jason, for the clarification. Any other further comments or questions? There being none, so we need to get a motion to vote to approve the enclosed draft Shrewsbury School Committee resolution on state reimbursement for COVID-19 expenses dated July 15th, 2020. Have a motion to approve?
Jason.
So I had made the motion and Dr. McGee said.
Okay. Second. Okay. All right. Motion and seconded. Roll call vote. Lindsay?
Aye.
Dale?
Aye.
Jason?
Aye.
Myself, aye. Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next time schedule appointment is a report on, let me just get my place here, report on reopening schools for the 2020-2021 school year. Here to present is Dr. Sawyer and Miss Meg Balsito. Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Wensky, and I'm going to try to share my screen here, and give me a moment. I'll make sure that it's working. And okay, I'm a little technical difficulty here, and I'm wondering, Ms. Balsito, I think, has the slide deck as well. Is it possible that she would be able to share the slides, Meg?
Sure. Hold on one second. Let me.
My apologies for that.
Are you able to see it?
Thank you. You can put it in presentation mode or play the slideshow. That would be great.
Sure.
Thank you. And so at this point, I did want to share with the committee and with the community some information on our reopening planning. If you can move to the next slide, please. I've updated the three key messages that we have as a district to adapt it a little bit to, we're moving out of sort of school closure mode and into planning for reopening mode. The health and well-being of students, families, and staff remains our first priority, of course. Our focus in the coming year is that we are planning to provide a safe school environment for all of our students and all of our staff, with the priority being, of course, everyone's well-being while enabling high levels of learning for everyone. We're planning right now based on guidance from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. We're closely monitoring the latest information from medical experts, and of course, looking at the evolving data specifically to the number of cases of COVID-19, both here in the state of Massachusetts, as well as right here in the town of Shrewsbury. I'm awaiting some updated results, and we're getting updated results once a week now on Thursdays from the town. Just of interest at this point, of the 325 cases that have been reported for Shrewsbury over the course of the entire pandemic, at the last time it was reported, only 3% of those cases were people under the age of 19, or 19 or under. And so it has been a very small number of students who are documented, or potential students of that age who have been documented of the 325 students, cases so far. Next slide, please. At this point, one really key piece that we've been working really hard at, and a team of people have been doing a tremendous amount of work, is going back to school this summer, actually starting this Monday, for a number of our students who receive extended school year services for special education. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Balsito, who will report on the work that's happening for remote, as well as starting on Monday, in-person learning for special education as part of our extended services. So Ms. Belcito, please take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So when you think about going back to school, much of the focus in both the media and in print is around the reopening in the fall. But we feel it's very important for our community to know that we have students returning to school this coming Monday, as well as staff. This is our transition to our next normal, while also thinking about our children that require extended school year services in order to maintain skills, prevent regression, and continue to engage in learning and social skills during this very, very challenging time. We have about 250 students that have qualified for extended school year services this year. We know that not all of the students will be returning in person this coming Monday, but we have about just about 100 or a little bit less that will be returning in both AM and PM sessions, which I'll go into a little bit more detail as I go through the slides. So as I've stated before in previous school committee meetings, we recognize this time of learning that we need for our students. And we began this work with the initial guidance from the Department of Education on June 7th, was the first document that the Department of Education sent out regarding our summer services. And it was not until July 1st that we received the final guidance to review health and safety updates for how we might hold in-person instructional opportunities for students with disabilities in order to provide extended school year programming. The Special Education Administration has since continued to collaborate very closely with our Director of Nursing, Noelle Freeman, and our Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations, Patrick Collins, to ensure all of our students' health and well-being as a top priority. Consideration was given to the nature and severity of a student's needs and the barriers they pose on the ability to access the remote learning. Determination of in-person instruction is based on providing services to our most vulnerable learners right now, who receive multiple services during the course of this time frame and who need more time to learn new skills to increase success of re-entry to school in the fall, however that might look. In addition to learning needs, we recognize that some of our families of the aforementioned students have concerns about the safety and health of their children and have chosen not to have them participate in in-person learning and have remained remote. Informational slides like these were created for families of intensive students that we plan to bring in for our extended school year starting next week. It was shared with these students' teams for editing and individualizing in order to then share with families and students. Staff are required to wear a mask, a face shield, gowns, and gloves when necessary. Here's a slide of a teacher and what we are sharing with our kids, that all teachers will be at Sherwood Middle School. We're only using one building. We want the children to know that they might recognize their teacher, but she will look different. At this time, we have all female teachers. She will have a mask on and maybe even a shield. Here's another example of a slide that's been shared with students. So here is Bridget Nichols, who is team chair, as well as this summer supporting our Educational Learning Center program as a coordinator, and she's also a board certified behavior analyst. The other picture here is Lindsay O'Donnell. She's the ELC coordinator for Patton Elementary, and she also will be working this summer. Another slide just to share is that we want the students all to know they can certainly ask parents or family members or their teacher if they have any questions. And most importantly, how excited we are to actually see students in person again. Today, going over to Sherwood Middle School to help with setup and to make sure that things are ready. It was awesome to just see staff coming into the building and around the grounds of the school, and just the happiness that that can bring to so many. We are really looking forward to next week. As part of the work, I just wanted to update the community around a few things around what this is going to look like this summer. Our guidance for in-person will be limited to just half-day programming. For those we offer in-person programming for, there may be additional remote services. Students are assigned in either AM or PM. Unfortunately, due to the operations planning, we're unable to honor what session requests. We were able to work with families the best way possible to ensure that whether it was AM or PM, as far as the very, very limited amount of transportation, we will have 2 buses running. The buses will be equipped with PPE. There'll be cleaning protocols, and this information was shared with families just this week in our reopening guidelines. Along with that sharing around transportation, we did safety protocols, what the staff training is going to look like, things of that nature went home in a 10-page document. And the other thing that I wanted to just stress is that all instruction this year will be 6 weeks. So we started 2 weeks ago with our remote on July 6th, and we will continue with remote all the way through August 13th. Our in-person will be July 20th to August 13th, Monday through Thursday. As we finalize our plans, we are extremely grateful for all staff, those that are working remotely right now and those that are coming in for in-person. And we thank them for coming back into the buildings this week, and they have gone into classrooms. They've gathered supplies, they've gathered materials, they've boxed them up, and they've brought them over to Sherwood Middle School. And they're setting up the learning environments 6 feet apart, the best way that we can. And we're also taking a look at things that we'll be using the materials with the students, because we need to ensure that we're able to keep the students safe, that the materials can be cleaned after each use, and that our bathrooms are things like our bathrooms and covering the water fountains, because we will not be able to use them. So it's definitely going to be a different extended school year, but we're ready. We definitely are excited to see the students as well as the dedicated staff that work with them each day. We know that the next normal is very different, but we have no doubt that everyone will do their best to instruct and support our students and families during the transition back to school, with the final thoughts around signs, visuals, and furnitures. All of that will be completed by Monday, July 20th. Our staff training and protocols and procedures will be completed by tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Ms. Belcito. And I just want to add my thanks to the planning team, to all the employees who are going to be coming back on Monday. Looking forward to greeting them and the online training that they're undergoing on Thursday. And it really is work that we have not done before in this to this scale, in terms of all the variety of protocols that we have to put in place. And I really appreciate all the effort that's been put into this. And we are really looking forward to having students return in this limited way on Monday after such a long time away. So thank you to Ms. Belcito and her team, and we'll certainly provide an update after things are underway for a couple of weeks with our in-person programming.
Thank you.
At this point, I'd like to shift gears. If you go to the next slide, we did send out a survey to families regarding reopening yesterday. We had some a terrific response. We asked families to fill out the survey multiple times if they had multiple children in the district. And as of this afternoon, there were 3,669 separate responses representing students. And they were evenly divided across the grade levels. If you go to the next slide, you can just see that's just the number of responses, a visual of that across the grade level. You can see it's quite even across the different grade level cohorts. We had some very interesting findings so far. The next slide is that we have some key data points regarding families' willingness to have their child return to school. Overall, across the entire district, 50% of students, families indicated, would return for in-person learning with all students if we were at everyone returning with 3-foot social distancing. 25% of the respondents indicated that they would not be comfortable having their child return, and 25% are still undecided. If they're broken down by the different grade level spans, It was a slightly higher percentage in terms of willingness to return at the high school level, 5% higher at 55%. And it was slightly lower for elementary students at 45%. And for middle school, it was right in the middle at the same level as the district level data overall. You can see this is a snapshot of the survey data. You can see it visually represented by the bar graph there, and the percentages below. Again, about 50% overall willing to return, 25% not, and 25% still undecided. For the next slide, the willingness to return to school was higher if it were going to be a hybrid schedule where we had a more limited number of students in the school at one time. Under that scenario, the willingness to return jumped up to 67% with an alternating schedule, fewer students again in classes and in the building, with 17% still say they would not be comfortable having their students return even with fewer students in the building, and 16% undecided. Again, the statistic was slightly higher for the high school with about 3/4 of students being willing to return under this scenario, and slightly lower for elementary with a little under 60%, and the middle school right there at the median or the middle of about 67%, about 2/3 of students who would return. Next slide, you can just see the same statistic represented visually. And if you move on to the next slide, we also asked about, in terms of the hybrid schedule, what things would look like or what people's preferences were, depending on if we did go to a hybrid schedule with an alternating schedule, whether there was a preference regarding the going 1 week at a time, for example, a calendar week of school days, Monday through Friday, alternating, or whether doing alternating by consecutive school days, for example, 3 consecutive school days where students would be in school, the next 3 school days, such as Monday, Wednesday, Friday in school, the next 3 days, Thursday, Friday, Monday being off, returning Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and rotating that way. You can see that there wasn't a strong preference for one model over the other, a slightly higher weighted average for the week over week preference, but you can see that they're pretty close in terms of the preference level for each of those models. Go to the next slide, you'll see that we asked students about taking the bus, or asked families about students taking the bus. You can see on this slide that there were 2 different options for yes. The first being like, yes, I would put my child on the bus as long as everyone wears masks and there are health protocols in place. About a little under 24, a little under 25% said that they would be willing to do that. Another 19% said, yes, I'd put my child on the bus, but only if the number of students on the bus is less than what's a typical run, where they're providing additional physical distancing between students. 40% of families said, regardless of how many students are on the bus, I would not be having my child ride the bus, with about 16% not sure. Other data points around transportation, you can see in combination about 43% of responses indicated that students might ride, with 40% not. Interestingly, 62% of students who families indicated would stop riding the bus would be driven to school instead. And that obviously would create some operational challenges for us in terms of already having high levels of traffic at lots of our schools with normal bus ridership. And if we have lots of families who choose to not have their child ride the bus and instead they drive them to school, we are going to have some significant traffic issues we would have to work with and work through. One note is that looking at the total number of people who answered that question, although they were asked to answer it only if they were riding the bus this year and were planning on stopping riding the bus under next year's scenarios, so it may include some people who actually drove their student last year and just put down on the item that they would continue, they were perceiving it as they would be continuing to drive their student. We will be getting additional data and more granular data by actual student and their family coming up, but for this snapshot, it's an important piece of data to consider, but there may be that caveat that there may be some of that data may not be entirely accurate. The next slide, we asked families to talk about their willingness to have students eat their meals in our school cafeteria if there were health protocols in place. 14% responded they would get meals at school on most days. 26% said they'd get meals occasionally at school, and 55% said that they would be bringing food from home, regardless of whatever kinds of protocols might be in place. The rest were undecided at this time. We're also going to need some more specific data. We did ask a couple of questions about continuing extended school care and whether or not families who had students at Oak or the high school who would play athletics, if they would be comfortable having them play. Unfortunately, and this is my fault in asking the question, clearly lots of families who either don't even have students at that level answered the question anyways, just signaling what they would prefer to do, I think, if they were in that situation. So we're going to be doing some more specific surveying of those particular populations to make sure we get much more specific and accurate data. But we certainly appreciate those who filled out those pieces of information. But we'll be looking for more additional data on those in the coming days and weeks. So our continued planning for reopening. We do have plans regarding 3 different modes, whether that's full in-person learning with that 3-foot social distancing, a hybrid model where students will be on an alternating schedule, or full remote learning. We have extensive plans that have to be submitted by July 31st to the Department of Education. We're going to need to make a decision for our school district, certainly by early August. And there is a tremendous amount of work happening with subcommittees for reopening going on right now in the various areas we have to address. We are going to ask for specific family preferences by student. We'll be doing that through the Power School Parent Portal in the near future, so that families' responses are tied to their students' records. So we'll be able to do more specific planning around who is intending to return to school and who is not, as well as more specific information around things like extended day and athletics and so forth. And in the meantime, we're very pleased that we received a great deal of emails yesterday. We provided this email address as part of the survey. If you have a question or you have feedback around the reopening, you're welcome to send an email to this email address to 2020-2020reopen@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. And we appreciate everyone who took the time to share their perspective with us. Those perspectives will be shared with the various reopening task force subcommittees, as well as with the administrative team. So again, we appreciate the engagement and how quickly our families engage with this. We're going to leave the survey open for through next Monday. I don't expect the results will change a whole lot, given that we already have so many and such a high percentage of responses. But certainly people are welcome to give their input or send us an email at this address. And at this point, I would be happy to take any questions the committee has relative to the special education summer program or the survey data.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer and Ms. Belcito. Colleagues, questions or comments? Lindsay.
Thank you all so very much for all of the information. It's always good to get up to speed. I'm excited for you, Meg and team, to see how it rolls out, and our most precious kids are where we're beginning. So I'm really happy about that. I think when it comes to the survey, something that is a little news to me, and so I want to just confirm and make sure that it's accurate for the public's sake. The guidance that we're now receiving from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, I guess the word is requires that we provide multiple options for folks. And so if you could just speak to that a little bit, because I think that still feels like a new and evolving piece of guidance that we're getting from the state. And then early thinking about sort of there's, I could choose to keep my child home. I would do remote. The school could choose to have a full in-person model, or the school could choose to have hybrid. It's difficult for families to understand all those nuances. And sure. I know you're trying, but maybe we could just go back a minute.
Sure, no, I'd be happy to. And I'm actually just opening up the website from the Department of Education so I can try to get some of the very specific language that they're giving us relative to that issue. So bear with me for one moment.
Not a problem. I think of myself as a well-informed person, and yet every day, I'm sort of surprised there's another new thing as it comes to our schools. So if those of us who are elected to help lead the system are confused. I can't imagine how parents who are getting pieces of this are feeling as well.
Yes, and so let me, there was an FAQ document that the department sent last Friday that indicated that school districts, and the question was, are school districts responsible for students who are choosing remote learning? So which obviously indicates that there's a choice for families. The answer from the department was yes, school districts are responsible for students who are engaging in remote learning, and that the remote learning models would have to have certain requirements relative to participation. That has to be part of our plan in terms of what we'd be providing for students. But essentially, the message we're getting is that if families, for whatever reason, there's another question, say, can parents choose whether to send their children to school or keep them learning remotely? And the answer from the department was that parents or caregivers can choose to send their children to in-person school or keep them at home learning remotely. In-school attendance is highly encouraged to promote student academic progress because there is no substitute for the attention and engagement possible with in-person learning. That's the quote from the document we received from the Department of Education. So I think, one way to try to clarify would be that while we need to provide these three different plans, full remote learning is pretty clear. That's what we experienced in the spring, but it will be a more robust remote learning approach, and that's what we're planning for, given that we've had more time, obviously, to plan and learn from what we did over the past spring. In terms of what would be considered to be full in-person learning, what that would mean is that still families could opt out of that. So there would be some level of remote learning we would still need to provide. And then there would be this hybrid of the two, where there is all students would be receiving some level of remote learning on an alternating schedule with the opportunity to also be in person. But I think it's pretty clear from the survey data that right now we have a pretty significant percentage, about 25% of our families, or at least 25% of our students, I should say, where families are signaling that they would make the choice not to have their child participate in any in-person learning if we have people coming in person every day, and about 17% or so if they were alternating by a week with fewer students in the building who still would want to opt for purely remote learning from home. So this is important feedback for us to have as we continue to do our planning. I think that in a conversation that I've had with some superintendents over the last couple of days, I think those who asked this question a week ago or even a couple of weeks ago had data that may be a little bit different, because it seems that based on the data that's coming from around the country with increases in the number of cases in other places, concern about the potential increase as the economy opens more here in Massachusetts, and certainly the level of national dialogue with regard to what the federal government is advising or wanting to see happen, and a number of news stories about issues relative to that that may be causing people to either be undecided at this point or thinking that they may not be ready for their child to come back physically. So that is the information we have at this point.
May I ask one follow-up, just to
Yes,
make
go
sure?
ahead.
The idea of the, as best as you understand from the guidance that we're receiving, the idea of the hybrid model would be dictated by public health, and that there may be, or maybe school specific. I think that's a confusing point, that we could have one school that maybe has a flare up and they need to go, or would that be potentially a district kind of wide decision, if we know?
Sure. We are expecting to get from the state actually a very substantial advisory relative to what they're calling start and stop guidance. So for example, if we're back in some kind of in-person mode, whether that's full in-person or whether that's the hybrid with the smaller populations on an alternating schedule, if there were to be a case in a school, my understanding is that the indication is that they're looking for potentially, forcing to go full remote, probably on a school by school basis. I'm not clear whether or not the presence of one case would cause a school to have to close for some period of time, or if there would be other mitigation in terms of deep cleaning So that's an advisory we're still waiting for. But in terms of what our plan would be for the district, right now that hasn't been formulated entirely yet. Right now we need to present plans for what it would look like for the full district to be in those different 3 modes. But whether or not there'd be any mixing and matching at different levels is something that we would want to certainly consider in terms of what the best match is for Shrewsbury Public Schools at this time. I think the biggest issue right now in terms of controversy, I guess would be one way to put it, is the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, based on their advisories from the Massachusetts Pediatrics Organization, as well as medical experts from a variety of places in Massachusetts, including Massachusetts General Hospital, indicating that in a school setting, again, based on some studies of schools that reopened in Europe, that a 3-foot distance is actually essentially or is able to be had in terms of being as effective or nearly as effective as a 6-foot distance. That is in the documents that are connected to their advisory. I know that there are some who believe that since 6 feet of distance is what essentially has been the standard for a variety of things during the pandemic, that having less than 6 feet in schools is something that concerns some people. And that will be certainly the difference for us to a great degree in how many students we will be able to have come back. Because if we're at a 6-foot physical distancing measure, it would be next to impossible to bring all of our students back. It may be a moot point, however, if we have a substantial percentage of people who are going to opt out regardless, that may bring the population down and enable more physical distancing, even if those who wanted to be in school in person were coming every day as opposed to alternating weeks in order to draw the population down. But there's no question that right now it's very complicated. There's a lot of complexity. And one of our tasks will be, as we develop these plans, to try to put them in as comprehensible a format as possible to help make sure that there is the greatest degree of understanding among our parent community, our students, and our educators and support staff. And that's work that's happening over the next couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any additional questions? Jason.
Just a comment. I want to thank Dr. Sawyer and the district's leadership team for their work doing this very, very careful planning work, which is happening against what I know is a backdrop of information that is changing very rapidly. I guess I also, I said comment, but it's also a question, and maybe for Dr. Sawyer, maybe for Ms. Clowder, and it might be something that we aren't able to answer yet. One topic that's come up at our meetings and is a particular concern to me, and I know a number of others as well, is students who may be for one reason or another struggling with remote learning. Obviously, remote learning has impacted families in very unequal ways. You have some families that are handling the adjustment fine. You have some families where it's a challenge, be it access to your familiarity with technology, family work schedules. If there is a situation, and I understand, that there will be some element of family choice with a hybrid model. If there were to be a situation where there were a student in a remote setting whose development from our perspective was not where it needed to be, would there be a situation where a conversation was had with a family about maybe making a recommendation about changing the child's educational setting? Is it too early to know how that might work? I'm just concerned again, because I know that we are seeing remote learning is not falling on families in the same ways. And I apologize for a very loaded question.
Well, I think that the simple answer is that we always want to be communicating with families when we have concerns about a child's academic progress or their social or emotional development, whether under normal circumstances or especially under these circumstances. It is the conundrum families face right now around this choice and around what they want to see for their child. Is that you may have a situation, as you alluded to, Mr. Palich, that where a student may be really struggling with a remote learning kind of approach. Yet at the same time, the family may have very real concerns around issues related to susceptibility to the virus, or that, whether there's an immunocompromised person in the home, an elderly person with whom they live, and weighing obviously this is the debate, of course, right now. The message and the reason that the Department of Education and groups like the pediatricians professional group are really urging trying to get students back in person in school is because they know that there are a variety of deleterious effects of students being out of school, and weighing that risk against the risk of contracting COVID. Which, the good news is the studies in Europe when schools reopen are showing that transmission among children tends to be very, very low. But again, there's different people's comfort level with those pieces. And part of the work that we're doing is not only about putting together a technical plan, it is trying to respond to families and staff members' fears and anxieties around these issues, which are very legitimate. And it's a very complicated situation. But if we felt a student was really not doing well in that situation, we certainly would want to have that conversation with the family about potentially returning to in-person learning. But again, right now, based on the way that the guidelines are, that ultimately would be the family's choice, and we'd have to do the best we can within whatever choice that is to help the student be as successful as possible.
Thank you.
Great. Any further questions or comments? Okay. First off, I'd like to thank Ms. Belcito for walking us through the summer 2020 plans for the extended school care. As you said, Ms. Belcito, certainly the next normal will be very different. But I do appreciate all the work and the careful preparations that are going into making the program a reality. And thank you to the planning team and certainly everybody involved. Certainly the health, safety, and well-being of our students, our staff, and our educators are priority one. Also, Dr. Sawyer, I appreciate you presenting the early results of the survey. I must say I'm impressed with 3,600 responses in less than 24 hours. That's pretty impressive. It speaks to the impact, certainly, of the email communication that we've certainly seen in other surveys. And certainly family engagement, and this topic is on a lot of families' minds. So thank you so much for presenting that. Okay, our next item on the agenda is under Finance and Operations. We'll review the transportation, logistics, and fees for 2020 and 2021 school year. We'll be provided with a recommendation for a committee vote. Here to present is our Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations, Patrick Collins. Mr. Collins, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wensky. I am going to share my screen with a presentation. And I know that the committee just received this earlier today. And hopefully folks can see that. Yes. Okay, thank you. So the topics to cover this evening on this school transportation recommendation, as you mentioned, with a request for a vote at the end of this, is to talk about the status of the Department of Education guidance and regulations. Again, planning for the 3 reopening scenarios. Some of the major assumptions used that underscore and underlie the recommendation that is about to be made to you. Some of the prerequisites to operationalize school transportation services for any school year opening. Looking at service levels, ridership forecasting, and fiscal impacts will actually be detailed a little bit more in your budget update. In terms of the initial guidance from the Mass Department of Education that was relative to school reopening, that was issued on June 25th. And as I mentioned, this and showed this slide at your meeting last week when I did an update for considerations around the school transportation topic. I showed this slide and said that they expected to issue subsequently more detailed guidance or regulations related to school transportation. As of July 15th, that has not been provided. So we don't have any more details from the state around the provision of school bus services for fall reopening. So we're going to have to make some, because of the timeline, we're going to have to make some decisions in order to make this work for not only the school district, but our parents and students as well. So in terms of planning for the three reopening scenarios, the first, of course, all students returning to in-person or in-school learning with some restrictions or protocols in place. The major impacts on busing under that scenario really depend on the regulations that we await from the Mass Department of Education. So, for example, they could limit the number of students that could be on any singular bus. And that's what we've seen as some examples in other states. So that is a possibility. In that case, if we were to use our existing resources, we would need to decrease our service level because we have just enough buses to provide services for all the students who opt for transportation right now. And we maximize the seating capacity and routing right now. So if we were to then suppress the capacity of each of our buses, we would then need to consequently decrease the service level that we're providing. Or alternatively, or increased costs may be incurred for extended time needed to transport students under these conditions, potentially additional costs for monitors and possibly cleaning. So that's under some of the major considerations under the return in-person, in-school scenario. If we were to have a hybrid schedule, which is the second option, most of those hybrid schedules, the underpinning of that is that you take your school population and put it in half, with half the students in school and half the students at home. If that were the case, we could use our existing fleet of buses, and I believe with even restrictions on capacity, continue to operate at the same service level and provide rides to all those parents and students who wish to register for service. I am also expecting that there would be a significant bus fee revenue loss. As noted earlier, that many parents are going to be opting out likely from the service, and our original budget pre-COVID made an assumption of $750,000 in bus fee revenue because that was the trend from prior years. And so under a hybrid schedule where students are only receiving a bus ride for half the time, I would be expecting, and also on top of that, many people opting out, would expect to see significant bus fee revenue losses. Under full remote learning, of course, no buses run. And as we saw with the close of fiscal 20, there are certainly some reduced operating costs for transportation for that. Certainly all the fee revenue is lost. And then still, we do need to consider the possibility that under a so-called complete remote learning scenario, that one exception or a couple of exceptions might be that we would continue to provide in-person services for a very small population of students with disabilities and/or English language learners. So we may be operating some buses and trying to bring some very small populations of students back to the schools if that were possible. And then, of course, the last part of this slide basically kind of states what we all know to be the case, that how we open schools or how we start the school year, for example, whether it be in-person, hybrid, or remote, is very likely to change during the school year, so that we might begin in person, in school with all students, but then have to switch to a remote and then have to transition back in a hybrid. That would just be one possibility. So the combination of models is likely to occur during the course of the upcoming 2020-2021 school year. So that's transportation through the lens of kind of the three reopening scenarios. Some of the major assumptions that were made in terms of making this recommendation, that is that we would endeavor to try to keep the school start and end times nearly the same or close to the same. Of course, as I made mention at your last meeting, I think we would have to make some, at least at a minimum, make some internal adjustments to allow more time for students to arrive on campus and get to their classrooms and put their things away, and certainly expect much more traffic volume at all of our school sites. So we would need to compensate for that. And maybe that's within the context of a normal regular school day. But the assumption was that we would keep the school start and end times at least sequentially the same under this 3-tiered busing schedule that we currently operate, where we take our busing fleet and we allocate it to doing all high school runs first thing in the morning and bringing all those students to school. And then after they drop them off, they circle back out throughout the community and they pick up all the middle school students for both Sherwood and Oak on the same buses. They drop them off at the Sherwood Oak campus. And then they have a third tier, and then they disperse themselves geographically into quadrants, if you will, and then service elementary schools. So the assumption is that we would continue to operate this kind of 3-tiered busing schedule going forward. And then, of course, in italics here is that our legal responsibility to continue transportation services for Assabet Valley Technical High School remains, as it does for all private schools, Department of Ed private schools that are located in Shrewsbury, to include St. John's, St. Mary's, Montessori, Elhammer Academy, and Lilliput, and that they may have different reopening plans than Shrewsbury Public Schools, but still, whatever their reopening plans are, if it requires in-person or in-student services, we would need to be providing transportation services to those students as well. So that legal responsibility persists. I made this assumption, and I think that the initial survey data that Dr. Sawyer just summarized for you previously and just recently obtained is that regardless of the reopening model, that bus ridership will decrease. It would decrease, from a very fundamental perspective of students who opt out for remote learning. So those students aren't coming to school. They're not going to need transportation services. And the students who were riders last year, but have some, fear or around riding a bus this year would be opting out of busing due to COVID concerns. So that we think the combination of those two populations are certainly going to contribute to a decreased ridership of busing. So that's an assumption. Prerequisites to reopening, include we need to know what the rules of the game are, and we don't know those yet. And so as a default, I think that planning for a decreased capacity ridership of, say, 26 to 28 students per bus, which basically is about a 1 student per seat scenario, is the way to plan right now, absent other information. We need to know, in order to provide transportation services, we need to know exactly what students need to be riding the bus so that we can provide that services. If we don't know who needs a ride, then we can't provide the service. And we do have control over that by opening up bus registration. We don't have any control over when the Department of Ed releases their guidance around capacity limitations. And so the action required around this prerequisite for knowing what students need to ride would be to open up bus registration, and then also plan for a reduced ridership. That would be the safest option. We certainly need time. Our transportation vendor does all of the detailed routing, and they need time to develop those routes. Certainly as a default, we would use our current routes as a starting point. And then finally, we need time after routes are developed and tweaked and adjusted to account for decreased ridership or potentially new riders on new streets. We need time to communicate bus information to parents. And we think that given the current school year schedule, that August 19th would be the typical deadline by which we would provide that information to parents through the Power School Parent Portal. And certainly, in order to pull off all of those things, if you try to backwards plan that, certainly time is of the essence in terms of making some decisions relative to transportation. That's why we're making a recommendation for you to vote on this evening. Some of the environmental factors, of course, to state the obvious, of course, there's a high degree of uncertainty about our learning model at the start of the school year and throughout the year. We could face periodic school closures if the virus were to take hold in a certain school or throughout the district or community. That the bus fee in the model of paying up front one time provides many complexities in this environment, in that there are equity issues and consideration regarding different families' ability to transport their children to school. And we're trying to consider those as well going forward. I showed this slide last week as well, which was ridership data from last year, and kind of bifurcating, if you will, by school, the number of students and the percentage of students who were taking a bus ride and living within or under 2 miles their home to school, to their assigned school, and then those students who live 2 or more miles from their school. The state regulation for school transportation says that all school districts must provide free transportation to kindergarten through grade 6 students who live 2 or more miles from their school. That's the minimum state regulation. In Shrewsbury, our model has been to not only meet that minimum, but also exceed it and provide services to basically all students. And if they're not in that 2 or more miles or kindergarten through grade 6, then we charge them a fee. So we provide eligibility for services for all students, regardless of mileage. Some students get charged and some don't. But you can see that the under 2 miles represents just about 1/3 of our bus ridership, and 2 or more miles represents about 2/3. That's kind of the key data that we have. So into some recommendations. My first recommendation would be to waive the bus fee for at least the first half of the school year. Again, having the bus fee complicates these matters significantly. It's also a hurdle and a major consideration for parents, whether or not they're going to register for the bus in a very uncertain environment. I think that if we were to continue with the current model of you must pay $315 all up front right now, that we would have very few people opt for buses, and that would exacerbate our traffic problems at all of our schools. And then again, as we faced at the end of this school year, providing up to over 2,500 bus refunds and all of the work that's associated with that we're not really normally staffed to do, complicates the matter. So that's under waiving the bus fee for at least the first half of the school year is the first major recommendation. The second is to take a phased approach to busing eligibility until we can measure our ability to provide services under the DESE regulations, which are yet to be published. And so that you'll see in a few minutes that what I'm suggesting as a recommendation is to open up to a certain population now, get some immediate registrations and results, and then allow the superintendent to make some changes to that to increase eligibility as the situation permits, with the goal and intent of providing transportation services to as many students as we possibly can, given the restrictions that we might face. And then finally, the third major recommendation is to open up bus registration now, with the reduced eligibility for service as anticipated limitation from the Department of Education. But if we don't start acting now, we're not going to be able to turn around bus routes develop those and provide parents information or a certainty about that their student is going to have a ride if schools reopen in the fall. And that's the other piece about opening up now is we need to give some of our parents some certainty in this very uncertain world. And the other part of that is what we don't want to do is open it up, almost unrestricted, if you will, and then find out that our registrations exceed our capacity, and then be in a situation of telling hundreds of parents, sorry, you weren't early enough to register, so you don't have a ride now, and change their plans. So I'm trying to do this in an incremental way, if you will, in a phased way is the recommendation. So in terms of phases, the phased eligibility recommendation would be phase 1 would be now, and then until we can further assess the DESE bus regulations and what that means, and to restrict eligibility to registration and for services to students who live 2 or more miles from their assigned school. Again, that's about 2/3 of our ridership from last year. And then phase 2 would be as soon as we receive those DESE regulations about school transportation, we would evaluate those and see if there are limitations on ridership. We'd be able to take a look at what registrations we have, and then potentially expand eligibility for ridership to less than 2 miles. Maybe we reduce it down to, say, a mile or more from school as kind of the next iteration, and then we see how we're looking, and then we open it up to where our current situation is to whoever needs a ride, we could provide eligibility. That would be kind of the hope, if you will, in terms of this phased incremental approach. In terms of the rationale, we have to plan for right now, I think, for a full return of all students, because that, in terms of transportation, because that represents our highest demand for services, and that's kind of our so-called worst case scenario. We have to plan right now that there will be some rules that restrict ridership and thereby reducing our carrying capacity. And then to the best of our ability, we need to actually provide the service if a student is registered and not change plans on parents later, again, by finding out that we inadvertently exceeded the bus registration. Our bus registration is a very automated process, and we don't have staffing to, hand manipulate, if you will, every individual registration. But we can do it through technology. And our tech folks have been in consultation with, can work with this kind of system and allow for a system that says when a parent tries to register, the system will first look at the mileage from home and then either block registration with a message saying, sorry, you're too close to school, try again later kind of thing. And of course, it would be a better message than that, more detailed. And then if the student were 2 or more miles, it would allow for that registration to occur. In terms of what this might mean, again, this is a process of estimating what this recommendation would be. Certainly we know that if we restrict eligibility to students 2 or more miles from school, right there, it takes out at least 30% of our ridership, probably closer to 33%. But just to be safe, just for simple math, say it's 30%. And if for simple, math and taking the superintendent's latest survey data, 10% of the students just opt out completely for remote learning, regardless of our return to school plans. And that even if, so that's 10%. And then let's just say another 10% of kids who rode last year will return to school this year, but aren't going to ride the bus. They're going to have a parent drive them. Say that's another 10%. Then that would reduce our ridership by 50%. And at that level, we can certainly, I'm confident based upon this kind of estimating that at 2 or more miles, we could provide services for all parents who register. Again, the rationale would be, let's start with a phased approach. And if it's overly restrictive, we can become more inclusive as the weeks unfold. And then again, if it's decided somewhere down in a couple of weeks from now that we're going to start with a hybrid model, we can quickly pivot our transportation services to and message to the parent community, look, we don't need to have any restrictions. We're reopening up registration. If you need a ride, register for bus service. because under the hybrid model, we don't need to have any mileage restrictions. I believe that we have sufficient carrying capacity to carry all students, even if there were reduced capacity enforced by the Department of Education. So I know this is a complicated situation, as is all of these matters, but I think it's important that the school committee do take a vote. We've provided this recommended action and vote, and it's kind of in two parts. The first would be to waive the fee for the first half of the school year and revisit it, in the November, December timeframe for potentially change in January. And we'll see what our situation dictates then. And then the second part of the motion is really around to restrict ridership at the outset, but grant the superintendent the authority to relax that restriction with the goal of providing more services to more families as the situation warrants. And with that, I'm happy to turn it back to you, Mr. Wensky, for any kind of questions or clarity that might be required by school committee members.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Colleagues, any questions or comments? And actually, Patrick, if you can just stop sharing your screen, that'd be good.
Sure.
Sure. Okay, great. Ms. Heffernan.
Thank you. I've been thinking about this issue all day, and fundamentally what I am concerned about, I know we have to make decisions, and I recognize our operational impacts are significant, and parents, my family wants some stability and some understanding about what's happening. So I'm very cognizant of that. What I'm concerned about is that we are addressing and we are attending to those who need buses versus those for whom it is a convenience. And I think particularly the issue of equity really needs to be at the front of our thinking. And we don't have a lot of time, and we're moving very fast. And I want to just pause us a little bit and make sure we're making the right decision. A couple of things that I think about, though. In the world of unknowns right now, we haven't made decisions about before and after school care and what might happen there, which impacts potential buses. We haven't thought about those who won't attend, but might, particularly if we don't have a fee, and I appreciate the reasons not to have a fee, sign up for buses just as I'll save my spot, but maybe aren't even thinking they're going to attend school. And at the same time, I'm concerned that that for particularly lower income families, buses for whom a bus has never had a fee, and I think is providing a very, very critical service versus individuals like myself who are now working from home and will be working from home for a long time, for whom the drop-off line is an inconvenience, but is a manageable inconvenience and headache. And those who maybe really need it because they are working in shift hours and are not actually able to be home, and the bus is really critical. And unfortunately, the 2-mile line, while it's the law and we have to follow it, it doesn't get at any of that nuance. And additionally, doesn't get to any nuance around the issues of safety for some kids who may be within that 2-mile bucket buffer, but have to cross major streets. Our community in some places is not well designed for issues like walking. So I am very concerned that while we need to move quickly, that we make really good choices here, and because each one of them impacts the other. My first thought about not having fees, Patrick was right. Don't have fees. This was a huge headache. It's difficult. We have to return the money. We go hybrid. People and then I think, oh, there is a problem with not having a fee. As much as I hate fees, and that people will take spots and maybe not need it when others who need it but are within the 2-mile buffer don't get it. So I'm not actually proposing any solutions. I'm just raising more issues, unfortunately, that give me real concern about how we move forward tonight. I'm very curious to hear what some of my colleagues think.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Heffernan. Any other comments or questions? Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Wensky. I do want to echo some of Ms. Heffernan's concerns. I do want to start by thanking Mr. Collins and his team for their work. The logistics around this to me is like juggling shards of glass. There is no, in particular, this strikes me as a place where the state has really fallen down in terms of the timeliness or lack thereof of its guidance. And actually, a quick question here for Mr. Collins or Dr. Sawyer. Has there been any signaling from DESE with regard to when we might see that transportation-specific guidance?
We're being told to expect it in the next week or so.
Okay. I mean, I'm glad to hear that, but even still, we're having this conversation tonight because we're at a point where decisions have to be made. I want to echo Ms. Heffernan's concerns, in particular, with regard to equity and overall. Well, it's only about a third of students who are within the 2 mile. Obviously, that hits our elementary families harder just because of having 4 of them dispersed throughout the town. Just inevitably means that more families are going to geographically live close to their elementary school. I do feel like the language in the recommended motion we have before us tonight in the second section does provide some flexibility. And so I guess I would like to ask Ms. Heffernan if there is a comfort level in the flexibility in the vote that we're being asked to take tonight, that we would be able to respond to a changing situation.
I certainly appreciate, and I have the utmost respect for our administration to make good decisions. I just, and particularly in light of our community's cry out for us to be really thoughtful about the issue of equity, I think it's notable for us to take a moment. I wonder, I said I didn't have a solution, but I'm thinking, I'm wondering on my feet, so I need some help here. If there's a way to open up registration for those over 2 miles, and those who qualify for free and reduced lunch. I think if I understand from you, Mr. Collins, that's about 16% of our students that took the bus previously. And some of them may already be over 2 miles, so maybe that's a smaller figure. What your comfort level might be in doing that, and if that's a possibility, it would alleviate a lot of my angst. It's not a perfect fit either. It doesn't fit some of the safety issues, but so for those who receive free and reduced lunch, being in that first phase and what that might do to your estimates. And then thereafter, I'm very comfortable with the superintendent having the discretion to say, let's move it down to 1 mile, or you got to see what happens. But I wonder what you might think of that. And again, please, I'd love to hear it from others.
I think that it's an excellent question. And because I don't have the technical expertise that goes into the detailed code writing that would evaluate the registrant, that I'm not totally sure, but I have a fair degree of confidence that that type of allowance could be made. And certainly, maybe there's a way to, if the committee wanted to, adjust the language of the recommendation in a way that said, if that possibility existed, that we would roll out with that. I think from a transportation perspective and a carrying capacity perspective, it would be fine. What I just can't tell you definitively right now is, can at the point of registration, can we evaluate both measured distance and the current free and reduced? I think that we can. And I'd certainly be comfortable saying that we would have the carrying capacity to do that if it were technically feasible. And certainly we'd like to do that. The complication that would occur, however, I want to be totally upfront, is that in those areas in neighborhoods where if you live in one home on 10 Main Street and you are under 2 miles and you're not eligible for free and reduced lunch, but you want a ride, you're not getting a ride. If your neighbor who lives at number 12 Main Street has a student who's eligible for free reduced lunch, wants a ride, they'd be, under this scenario, they'd be able to get a ride. And the way that would play out in kind of a suburban single family home neighborhood could cause some problems for neighborhood dynamics. And as a practical matter, it could cause some problems at our apartment complexes where we literally have bus stops of 20 and 30 students at a time. For high school runs, some of our larger apartment complexes, we might pick up 20 or 30 students for the middle school with one bus. And discerning, the bus driver is going to have no ability, no time, no discernment about who is, eligible to ride or not. And so that could cause us some transportation problems. So that's one of the complicating factors of having that kind of policy decision made. And I hope I'm trying to explain it, in the way that I can. But under the current transportation system, it doesn't call out students who are free and reduced to their neighbors, because we provide transportation services to anybody, and some just pay and some don't pay. Students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch, regardless of distance, don't have to pay a fee. That's a state law. So making an exception for free and reduced students could, in fact, call out or make it known that they're eligible for free and reduced lunch and cause some problems in the neighborhood. And it would also potentially cause some problems, not in the registration process, but at the time when school opens and families just say, that's the school bus, that's where the school bus stop has been, at this, apartment complex, just go wait there and get on the bus. And that could cause us some ridership capacity problems.
So I really appreciate that, and it's thoughtful on your feet response. I'm thinking in my neighborhood, my house is on the line of the 1.9 mile and 2 mile, and so and families meet at the same bus stop. So we've appreciated, and that has felt as arbitrary. This at least feels like it's rational and tied to student need. I think it's probably important that we do something to educate the community and say, it may become more transparent to your neighbors, and we could say, and even a disclaimer in the sign up. And I recognize that we are all trying to move towards offering the bus ultimately to as many students as we can, but we want to be phased. Hopefully we could get to a place where that isn't an issue. Certainly at the high school level, I'm less concerned because the vast majority of kids, based on your data, are over 2 miles. And so 93%. It's at the elementary level where the cherry picking, maybe by apartment complexes and the like would probably be exacerbated. I think it might pose for me. It makes me much more comfortable with the idea that we're acknowledging the concerns, particularly at the elementary level, where I know we're all concerned about little kids getting to school. We want that to happen, but little kids whose families might not have a car and might not have other options is of greater concern to me. And so I actually don't have a language of emotion in front of me, and be happy to make some sort of amendment if others are interested, but I don't know what my other colleagues think.
Yeah. I think that the final point that I would say is that all of this might become a moot point if we went to a hybrid model. Then, we would be opening up bus registration for all students again, and it would not identify a student as eligible for free or reduced lunch. So it might become a moot point very quickly. I don't want to diminish this idea and I'm not suggesting that your idea your idea has lots of merit. And at the same time, it does necessarily could identify some students as eligible for free or reduced lunch. And that's something that we also value in our district in terms of trying to not do that. And we go to exceeding lengths to try to not do that. So it might have an unintended consequence in some cases. That's the only potential downside, in addition to the apartment complexes where we've got these cluster of kids and parents just kind of ignore all the rules and say, just go get on the bus. So.
Dr. Sir.
I would just add, in terms of, another complicating factor, is that there are a variety. I'm not as familiar with the letter of the regulations, but I know many of the regulations relative to the free and reduced lunch program, which is a federal program administered through the state, is the maintaining of confidentiality. And so if there were a perception that by trying to assist, it inadvertently identifies someone and breaches that confidentiality of their status, their socioeconomic status relative to free and reduced lunch, that is something that is also part of the mix here as well. But I certainly understand the intent and the certainly, you know, we would like to provide the transportation option to as many students as we possibly can. That is the intent here. I certainly, it'll be, it's the, if the committee would like to adjust the language of the motion in terms of how to direct the administration in terms of to whom we should open up registration, that's the purview of the committee, and we'll certainly execute to whatever the decision is tonight.
Dr. McGee.
I'm just wondering if there's it sounds to me like part of the issue here has to do with getting kids to school who don't have a ride. And if we were to phrase it that way, as a hardship exception because this person does not have a ride, that it won't be tied to their socioeconomic status, but from a practical point of view, will address those who, you know, are at a disadvantage.
Okay. Any other questions or comments, Mr. Powledge?
And, you know, I'm trying to think out to Ms. Efferdin's point, to Dr. McGee's point, where we can perhaps come up with some language or if an adjustment to the language is necessary. I mean, I think that the point, and I share the sentiments Ms. Efferdin has expressed, and I think the point that we're making here is we'd like to be as expansive as possible and try to recognize that some families are going to need more assistance with getting kids to school. We don't want the vagaries of this system to be blocking families. So I'm wondering if there is a way, and I guess I'll turn to Ms. Heffernan, if we can relax or alter the language in such a way that perhaps is not so specific as would bind us to something that would be a legal issue with regard to identifying students, but also authorizes or provides direction to look further into trying to meet these students' needs.
Yeah, and the part that I'm, you know, obliged to convey to you in terms of making this important decision is that we have an automated process, and we do not have any staffing to evaluate hardships. The registration process looks at data. It's a system with coding behind it. So when a parent goes to register, it will look at that student's home location, and then it will measure the distance from home to school that we have, and it will allow or block. I believe it can look at, you know, obviously a combination of factors, both mileage and free and reduced eligibility, which is a data point, which is a binary data point, yes or no, that the coding can allow for. But upon registration, it can't measure one's hardship. And so in those cases, that would require a staff person to do intake of a family situation and evaluate their situation and then make a decision about ridership or not. As part of your budget cut process that the transportation position was reduced from full-time to a half-time school year position. And I don't have any staffing in the office to do that kind of work right now. I certainly appreciate the creative thinking and whatnot, but I'm just obliged to tell you that it would be very difficult to try to have something that is not based upon kind of an automated objective system, if you will, and operationalize it for a few weeks away for school opening.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Actually, if I just make some comments, a lot has been said, certainly. But first off, thank you, Mr. Collins, for the presentation and all the thought and planning that's been put into this. I do think, we're still kind of flying blind in terms of state guidance. Obviously, we're still waiting, and it is, as you said, hard to know what to do if you don't know what the rules of the game are. I think you also need to look at the ridership decrease guesstimates, right? And they are guesstimates right now, because if you look at the data that Dr. Sawyer shared, previously, you've got 43% that might ride and a combination of, say 40% that don't intend or 17% that are undecided, right? And that can go either way based on, what the sentiment is at the time that, the plans start to materialize, right? So, you also have that faction that's going to, opt out and going to have remote learning only, right? So I think, I do echo the sentiments of my colleagues in terms of, how the language relates to equity. I think obviously equity is very important in this situation. The challenge that I'm hearing is that the level of unpredictability that we're sitting in right now makes it very difficult to adjust the language that's in front of us today. I think it's flexible enough from my perspective, and I mean, my own opinion, I'm comfortable, moving forward, and I certainly have the utmost confidence in the leadership to, try to make busing available to as many students as we can, at least as many that the state guidance will allow us to do. But there's so many things that we need to learn beyond this. I think it presents a challenge. At the same time, I think we do need to get started so we get a read on who's going to opt in for busing. Right, we don't even have a read on the outside of the survey results. So I do support the recommendations as written, in addition to waiving the bus fee for the first half of the year. That to me makes sense. With all the complexities around what we experienced in the last school year and refunds, et cetera. So, any other questions or comments, or Lindsay? Yeah.
Thank you. Here's what I'm thinking as a I think I appreciate where you're coming from, John, and that we know the administration continues to do their best for all of our young people. In terms of the decision that we make tonight, I wonder we bifurcated it. I wonder if I could take number 2 and break it actually down to 3 different votes. One on the bus fee, which it seems as though we're moving in the right direction on. I wonder if we were to make number 2 say something to the effect, and Jason, you're my wordsmither, so help me out here if you don't mind. To restrict ridership eligibility for bus transportation to students in grades K-12 who live more than 2 or more miles from their school, and something to the effect of a clause with an emphasis on allowing participation for those students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. And then we make a number 3, rather than make this clause totally unwieldy, to convey the authority of the superintendent to do and continue that as is. So the superintendent continues to have the authority as laid out, evolving state guidance and continuing to ensure equity. But that first rollout includes a focus on the lower income students. I'm even comfortable with it being the lower income students in K to 6 as a way to mitigate if there's concerns on the administration's part about the numbers. I wonder what folks might think of that.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, so if I'm following you correctly, Ms. Heffernan, maybe so where it starts off with number 2, to restrict ridership eligibility for bus transportation to students in grades K through 12 who live 2 or more miles from their school, comma, and then how would you feel about something, and further to students in grades K through 6 with a demonstrated financial need to the extent feasible? Because my thought here too is I want to do what we can without running afoul of a legal restriction that may present itself on identifying these kids. So something that would authorize the superintendent to go further without binding to something that we don't per se fully know the legal ramifications of. Would that fit with what you have in mind?
That makes me quite comfortable. I assume that we can get some support here. Sorry. Acting as if we're having a private conversation here.
Just to review, so for those who have the resolution in front of them, excuse me, not the resolution, the recommended motion in front of them, 1 would remain as is.
Yep.
2 would begin as is to restrict ridership eligibility for bus transportation to students in grades K through 12 who live 2 or more miles from their school. and to further authorize the superintendent to expand eligibility to students K through 6 based on demonstrated financial need to the extent feasible. And then 3, and to further convey the authority of the superintendent to, and then it would continue as written.
Got it. Okay.
And my understanding, just to clarify, my understanding is that would enable what Ms. Heffernan has put forward, the idea that would enable that to move forward with the understanding that if a legal hiccup were to prevent us from doing so, we have not bound the superintendent through vote to an unlawful action.
Okay. Dr. Sawyer.
Thank you. And I really, truly appreciate the committee's focus on trying to really put equity at the center of this. I think that along that language, I would suggest it remain. I heard from Mr. Collins that the numbers really aren't an issue, and I don't believe. I think bifurcating it with K to 6, you're going to have some households that have students who are attending the middle school campus who would be kind of split apart by that. I think I would suggest just keep it, just take out the reference to grade levels and just have the language about students with financial need. And then what we can do certainly is we can do our best to try to extend that. If, again, we have to find out what's possible in the coding system. I do believe that, we're going to know very quickly based on signups, kind of where we're running for capacity. We're certainly will report back to the school committee and the community. And, very quickly we'll be knowing whether we can expand it. And then we're going to be getting, within a couple of weeks, and really probably 3 weeks or so, we'll be making a recommendation for whether what type of learning plan we're going to have anyways, which may further expand opportunity. So this is all going to be evolving very quickly. And, I certainly hear loud and clear the will of the committee relative to wanting to try to expand this to families who need it as much as possible. But I wouldn't restrict it by the to K to 6.
That's fine by me, certainly.
Certainly. Thank you.
Any further questions or comments? Okay, there being
Would it
none,
be-
so
Mr. Chair, would it be helpful for me to try to redo the motion one more in full for everyone?
yes, actually, yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Pellage.
So I will move that the school committee, 1, waive the bus fee for the first half of the 2020-2021 school year. 2, yeah, you know what? I missed the grammar of the recommendation. Let me scroll up and start again. My apologies.
Yep.
Okay, I move that the committee vote to, note 1, that the committee vote to waive the bus fee for the first half of the 2020-2021 school year. 2, that the committee vote to restrict ridership eligibility for bus transportation to students in grades K through 12 who live 2 or more miles from their school. And to further authorize the superintendent to expand eligibility to students and families based on demonstrated need to the extent feasible. And 3, to convey the authority to the superintendent of schools to further expand eligibility for ridership beyond this threshold based upon A, evolving state regulations, B, budgetary resources, and C, equity of student access with the goal of providing the option of bus transportation to as many families as possible.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Second, okay. The motion's been moved and seconded. Roll call vote. Dr. McGee,
Aye.
Ms. Heffernan,
Aye.
Mr. Pallage,
Aye.
myself, aye. The motion carries unanimously. Thank you all very
Thank
much for the collaboration on that. Very good. Okay, our next topic on the agenda is also under finance and operations, and it's an update on the fiscal year 2020-21 budget. Mr. Collins, so I'll send it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wensky. And again, I'll share my screen with the latest budget information that we have to share with both you and the community. And just need to adjust my screen here a little bit. Okay, so I do want to provide some information relative to The revised annual budget development and appropriation strategy. Again, this is new information from your last meeting Wednesday evening. Things are moving very quickly. A revised management strategy for projected COVID-related expenses and revenue losses that we expect to be incurred in fiscal 21. Some updated budget projection models. Last week I showed you 2 models. I'm going to show you 4 more tonight. An update on the federal stimulus funds, and then revised budget approval schedule with a little bit more detail included from last week. So this latest information is really based upon guidance from the town manager, again, in some recent discussions relative to how to best approach fiscal 21. And we really appreciate his thinking, his guidance, and his leadership in this very complicated financial environment. And so 2 things that I think are key messages here is in terms of moving forward, and this would be true on both the municipal side of the operation and school department side. So the first 2 kind of major strategy pieces are, first, to kind of separate out all of the COVID-related costs from the annual operating budget. And from previous conversations and projections that I've been making is that I've been combining both our operating budget and some COVID-related costs that I did not expect to be covered by federal stimulus funds, because we need to account for those costs. And his guidance is to now keep those separate. And it provides a little bit of clarity about how to move up our budget process and through annual town meeting and into the fall. Certainly, if we separate those out, we will continue to plan to use the federal stimulus funds that have already been received by the school department or the town, or soon to be received by the school department in town. And we know, again, from previous updates, that those federal stimulus funds are not open-ended. They're use restricted for COVID-related costs only, and then only available up to December 30th, 2020. So they're time restricted. But yet again, even if we're expecting costs beyond that, the town manager's guidance is to separate that out from your annual operating budget preparation. Also, kind of new information is the plan to likely call a fall special town meeting, and at that time address potential or expected or accounted for shortfalls in funding on the school or municipal operations, potentially with the use of additional free cash. So that would be one strategy to try to move through this fog. And certainly at that time, we would have expected to gain some certainty on what the actual state aid amounts are from completion of the state budget process. And then accordingly, based upon that information, again, this is all just potential, depending on the results of the state budget process, is there might be some potential to increase municipal or school budgets or decrease them based upon actual state budget completion in comparison to what the town manager is projecting. So those are the 2 big things, separating out the COVID-related costs from the annual operating budget, and then now kind of doing this as a 2-step instead of a 1-step, which was a concept that Dr. McGee had brought up in prior meetings about how to address all of the uncertainty that we're facing. So again, we appreciate the town manager's strategic thinking in this area. In terms of separating out projected COVID-related costs, and we also have some revenue losses. And so what we need to do is separate those 2 things. And again, from the listings that I've shown you before, I've kind of combined those 2 things, that in this environment of COVID, we can expect things like additional costs for personal protective equipment. That's pretty easy, it's tangible, and it will be covered by federal stimulus funds. We know from the last report, we can also expect decreased bus fee revenue from fees. That's not something that we're sure could be covered by federal stimulus funds. So we still need to account for that in our annual budget in terms of revenue losses, not the costs, but the revenue losses. And so that's how we need to kind of move forward into this next iteration. In terms of the coronavirus relief fund, it's still unclear. This is the fund that provides $225 per student throughout the Commonwealth to all school districts directly. This is not through the town, but to the school departments directly through the Mass Department of Education, $225 per student. We're expecting approximately $1.4 million. But again, as of right now, it's unclear if the projected revenue losses can be resolved using those grant funds. So we're not expecting that they can. We're not counting on that because that's in other grant programs, they would term that supplanting, if you will, and that would be a disallowed use of funds. So it's unclear right now. We still have to incorporate the negative impact of those losses into our annual operating budget. And again, in terms of using the bus fee revenue, a total loss would be $750,000. 75% loss would be $562,000. And so I'm carrying those two levels into the future models that you're going to see about where we stand with our budget. So these are all the revenue losses that I'm still projecting that we need to account for. The only difference between the two columns I shaded, and again, it's relative to the bus fee. One is on the right, expecting no bus fee revenue, a total loss of $750,000. And then on the left side, expecting a 75% decrease. We know from your prior action, we can be guaranteed of at least a 50% reduction. And if we have a reduced ridership, then that would just further compound that. So we know we're going to see that level. I've also projected decreases in student activity and athletic fees to the tune of 25%. Same with full day kindergarten and preschool tuitions at 25%. And then gate receipts for athletics, that's the fees that people pay in order to get into, our football games, basketball games. And in order to, with the assumption that those programs will still run, but might limit spectators, or that we just have fewer people congregating in large crowds at a football game on a Saturday night. But we still need to pay for all those event costs like officials and alike, that we need to account for that $20,000 loss. So it's about $1.4 to $1.6 million that we still need to account for. So here's the models 3 through 6. Our budget status is the top row. This is after your budget reduction plan implementations. It's now at just about $67.5 million. The town manager's revised recommendation is going to be just under $67.1 million. So from where we were at the very outset of this process to pre-COVID to where we are now, about a $431,000 gap. When you add in these revenue losses, again, of $1.4 to $1.6 million, we're still looking at a gap of $1.8 to $2 million. So that's the total gap. Assume no additional state aid row. Under model number 3, it's $2,014,000. Under models 5 and 6, it's $1.8 million. So what I did just below that is to say, what if the town manager's estimate of state aid decreases is too much, and what if our situation is more favorable in state aid? And I used 2 different examples of $600,000 more than projected and $300,000 more than projected. Even with that type of better than expected results from state aid, we're still looking at anywhere between a $1.2 and a $1.7 million budget gap. So our situation is still serious. It's improving, but it's still serious, and we still have that range of gap. Depending on the situation, you can see a very low of model number 5 of just about $1.2 million gap to a high projected gap on model number 3 and 4 of a $2 million gap. So that's where we are in terms of the range and the models. And I did a couple other models, but didn't want to overcomplicate the situation. So there's a lot of different iterations, of course, you can do on this. And but in the interest of trying to provide some level of simplicity and boil this down, that's where we are right now. Again, I talked about the Coronavirus Relief Fund. As of right now, we don't have any further information. We don't have any money. We don't have any grant applications. But we do know it's going to be restricted to COVID-related expenses and that it will have definitely a use date of December 30th. And we kind of await further information from the Department of Ed. In terms of the schedule, again, backwards planning here. We know from the Board of Selectmen meeting last night that they invited town moderator Chris Mena, and that they've agreed upon the annual town meeting to be held on the Sherwood Oak campus on Saturday, August 8th, an all-day event. And that in order to prepare for that and inform the town meeting members and arm them with information for decision-making, that the mailing is going out on the 28th. That's the budget information mailing. That the Finance Committee budget hearings will be held next week. And we're expecting that in terms of operating budgets and school department budget, that they would be talking about that on Thursday, July 23rd. We'll be asking for a school committee vote recommendation next Wednesday on the 22nd. Board of Selectmen will meet on the 21st. And I know that we have a school committee budget workshop scheduled for Monday, the 20th. And then again, this footnote that we mentioned earlier, that it's likely that we're going to have to adapt our process for this upcoming year, meaning that typically we know, to the dollar and to the 0.10, FTE, exactly what our staffing and operating plans are going into the annual town meeting. We know all that information. We publish it, we provide it, and that's how we set forward after town meeting and into the new fiscal year. We think that this year, we're going to go into annual town meeting with some uncertainty about exactly how our staffing levels are going to play out. And it's certainly less than ideal from a lot of perspectives, but we'll continue probably to having to refine our expense plan even after annual town meeting. We should prepare for that. So that's what I have for the committee this evening in terms of an update. Situation is generally improving, but still major gap to close for fiscal 21.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Colleagues, any questions or comments? I don't see any. Okay. Ms. Heffernan, sorry.
Sorry, would we expect that our meeting on the 22nd, which is next week, my goodness, next week, that we would have any opportunity beyond public comment, any opportunity for public comment on a budget as we often have done? Would that happen, or would it just be open comment in the beginning? This is my first budget as a school committee member, and it's been a little crazy, so help me out.
Been a long process, I know. That's a good question.
We could table this for later.
Sure,
I
yeah.
just didn't know how this would
We'll
work.
follow up on that question. I think it's new for all of us. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay, there being none, we'll move on. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and certainly,
Ouch.
obviously, and we can deal with the logistics of Ms. Heffernan's question later. Certainly want to encourage anyone watching now who has feedback to please email the committee their comments, because we're happy to take your feedback immediately.
Absolutely. A good recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Palich. Okay. Moving on to the next item on the agenda is the approval.
Can I just add something, Mr. Wensky?
Yep. Go ahead.
Just a couple things, and thanking Mr. Collins for his report, of course, and also just emphasizing again that what we are trying to accomplish is to provide the maximum amount of transparency around where we are with our budget on practically a week-to-week basis. We think it's important that as conditions change and information changes, that we're providing that information to the community, to our staff who are watching, and making sure that we have the best, most recent information to share as we go through this process. I think that the Obviously, I'm grateful to the town manager that he is signaling around ways to handle direct COVID-related costs that won't be able to be handled as the rules permit at the moment beyond December by any of the federal or state funding that's come through for those purposes. That would be a very substantial relief to the school department budget as a result. But as Mr. Collins illustrated, there's a lot of revenue loss that still we need to account for. That keeps a very significant gap on the table. I know that we've signaled before that we are working with different union groups relative to the potential for cost mitigation. That work continues. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to bring some information relative to that, those discussions to a public meeting in the very near future. I do appreciate the fact that we are going to be looking at significant reductions, and we really don't have any place other than to go, other than positions, unless we're able to find other ways to shrink this gap. And any way we can mitigate those costs will help us preserve staffing and will help us mitigate the working conditions issue. The working conditions piece is so critical as we do our planning for getting back to school in some fashion. Obviously, the safety and the well-being of our students and our educators, all of our support staff, is critical. We know that this has to be our first priority, and certainly when we present a budget to town meeting, which a budget will be hopefully bringing to you next week, it would really pain me if we were actually going in the wrong direction and having fewer hands on deck to be able to help with these working condition issues relative to how we serve students in this new environment. So again, I'm hopeful we can find ways to continue to close this gap, but we need to do everything we possibly can with the focus on, obviously, the well-being of our students and our students' learning. And to do that, we have to be paying attention to the well-being and the safety of our staff.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. I didn't mean to rush through that, but
that's okay.
appreciate the comments. Certainly, also appreciate Mr. Collins' presentation and the continued support that he's been providing the committee, just navigating through really challenging financial times. Also appreciate the collaboration with the town manager, Kevin Mizikar, on this as well. And as you said, Dr. Sawyer, certainly while the gap is improving, there's still significant gap remaining. And it's also, as we've talked about in many meetings over the last several months, there are also many concerns about the costs that we don't know about, as well as the revenue losses as well. So I think it's important to keep everything in perspective, but certainly working conditions and safety is priority one. So thank you very much. Okay. Next item on the agenda is approval of minutes. Minutes from school committee meetings held on July 8th, 2020 and July 13th, 2020 have been provided. Any changes or revisions? There being none, they will be approved as written. Okay, the final item on the agenda, we do have to adjourn into executive session for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A7, to comply with or act under the authority of any general or special law or federal grant in-aid requirements. Purpose 7, open meeting law, Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 22FG, for the purpose of reviewing, approving, and or releasing executive session minutes. Also for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A3, to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining or litigation if an open meeting may have a detrimental effect of the bargaining or litigation position of the public body and the chair so declares. Purpose 3, the Shrewsbury Educational Association, Unit A, Shrewsbury Educational Association, Unit B, the Shrewsbury Paraprofessional Association, and or the Shrewsbury Cafeteria Workers. Do I have a motion to adjourn to executive session?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Roll call vote is required. Ms. Heffernan?
Aye.
Mr. Palich?
Aye.
Dr. McGee?
Aye.
Myself, aye. Thank you and good night.